This is our third Beowulf retelling video. At the end of our last video, had been impressed by his nephew's generosity after the defeat of Grendel and Grendel's mother had died. He left a baby boy, young Hardred, as the next king. The nobles, though, knew that a little boy could not be king. They were used to choosing warriors to become their king. So they went to Beowulf, asking Beowulf if he would be their king, but he refused, saying that young baby Hardred had much more of a right to rule than he did, and that he would support Hardred. So Hardred grew up under Beowulf's shadow. Beowulf became the viceroy. He became the person who runs the country until the king comes of age. And young Hardred was taught by Beowulf as well as Beowulf knew how to teach him. But kings sometimes have to be quite ruthless. There was not a ruthless bone in Beowulf's body. Beowulf got by because of his great strength. So young Hardred grew up to be a very kind-hearted king. But back in ancient times, sometimes people took advantage of a kind-hearted king, and that's what happened to young Hardred. King Onela of Sweden had two rebellious nephews who tried to take over the kingdom. King Onela was a mighty king. He defeated his nephews. Because they were his nephews, he would not kill them. But when they were arrested, he banished them from his land. Now, the kings of the north all had an agreement, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, that if they had a banished family member, no other king could take in those people. But when the two rebellious nephews showed up at Hardred's court, young Hardred felt sorry for them, doomed to wander the face of the earth without a real home. And so he took them in. King Onela heard about it, went into a fit, because a northern king had taken in rebels who had been banished. King Onela knew he could not go against Beowulf and hope to win, so he waited until hunting season, when it was well known when Beowulf would be out of the country hunting. And then King Onela invaded. Unfortunately, young Hardred, who was barely in his 20s, was killed in combat. Beowulf got back. They told Beowulf what had happened, and Beowulf became angrier than anyone had ever seen him before. He said, the only reason Onela attacked, he knew I would be gone. He said, I cannot let this go. This was not an honorable combat. I will face King Onela in single combat. They asked Beowulf if he would take on the mantle of their king now that Hardred was dead. And this time he said yes. They brought the roundlet, the little crown. They put it on Beowulf's head. He said, and my first act is to declare war on Sweden. And Beowulf went with his army against Sweden, called Onela out, one-on-one, in fair combat, and Beowulf killed King Onela in fair combat. He brought forth the two nephews that had tried to rebel against King Onela. Beowulf split up the country of Sweden. He put one nephew in charge of one area. He put the other nephew in charge of the others. He told those two nephews that they'd better behave themselves and get along, or he would come back and see to it. And they swore that they would do exactly what Beowulf told them to do. And then Beowulf went back to his own people and ruled over them for many, many years, for decades. Nobody dared attack Beowulf's people because Beowulf was too strong, even in his old age. He took to beekeeping. He liked beekeeping as a hobby. He said bees had taught him about order in the world of nature, and he tried to bring some of that order to the world of men as well. Later on, as he got to be an old man, his young warriors, of course, had nobody to fight, so they weren't exactly battle-tested, but they tried to train as best they could. People get their land and their armaments based on their promise to help the king whenever the king calls on them to do so. But, of course, Beowulf had not had to call on young men for 2 or 3 generations now. Beowulf got a little feeble-minded as he got older. Sometimes the young warriors would gather around. He'd say, have I ever told you boys about the time I defeated Grendel and Grendel's mother? They go, "Oh, yes, sir, King Beowulf, you told us about that a lot of times. Yes, sir. Oh, yes, I did that. I was a monster hunter when I was a young man. Have you boys ever killed monsters?" "No, sir, you've gotten rid of the monsters in the territory." "Yes, I have, because I'm Beowulf." They said, "Yes, sir, King Beowulf, that's right." Everybody loved Beowulf. But one day, there was one of their citizens who had taken one of the Swedes a long time ago as a battle slave, as was the custom of the people. And the old battle slave was now very old himself, as was his master. But the master was not a very kind man, and he threatened the old slave with a beating, which he always threatened, never delivered on, but he always threatened, so the old man always did what his master told him to. But this time he'd had enough. He was going to run away. Well, there was nowhere to run to, really. So the old man just ran up into the mountains to hide for a while, hoping his master's temper might cool, and then he could go back to his home. But nobody goes into the mountains, because they'd been used as burying places for kings and princes a long time ago, and as was the custom, a lot of their treasure had always been buried with them. It's thought best to leave such places alone. Plus, in ancient days, even more ancient than in Beowulf's time, dragons would sometimes find these treasure hoards and hibernate within the mountains. And so the superstition or the custom just grew up that you just don't go up there. You just leave those places alone. But the slave was so scared of his master that he ran into the mountains to hide. And as the slave ran into one of the crevices of a cave, a mountain cave, his eyes popped open. He couldn't believe what he saw. There was treasure everywhere. Well, if he'd got some of that treasure and took it back to his master, he'd make his master rich. He'd escape that beating. He'd be rewarded. So he picked up a big jeweled cup, big enough to bathe a baby in. And then all of a sudden, he realized what was hiding there underneath all of that treasure. It was a dragon, an old dragon who was hibernating. Probably been hibernating for decades and decades and decades. Most people thought dragons had already gone extinct. And the dragon opened his eyes and he saw this thief take this cup. Well, nobody was going to take his treasure. And he started going after the thief, and the dragon swelled up, and fire began to pour from the dragon's mouth. But the slave slipped through a crack in the rock and got outside, and the dragon was so swollen he couldn't fit outside. So he had to wait till his temper cooled. Meanwhile, the slave went back to his master, presented the jeweled cup. The master knew, "I'm rich." So he melted the cup down. He prized all the jewels off so he could sell those separately. And the master started buying land, and he had a big barn built for his stables, and he had a new house built in additions to the house that he already had. The neighbors wondered, where in the world did he get all that money? How in the world did he get rich so fast? Meanwhile, back at the cave, the dragon had cooled his temper, had sneaked out of his cave to the entrance of the cave, and he looked down at night time at all the lights in the valley of that county, and to him they looked like the lights of his great jeweled cup. And if he couldn't have his jeweled cup, nobody could have his jeweled cup. So the dragon began to swoop down and burn everything he could find. Houses, churches, fields of grain. Nothing was spared by the fire drake in this ruinous flight. Word finally got to Beowulf. And the word was, a dragon is terrorizing the people. And old Beowulf, a dragon? There are no dragons left. Dragons died out a long time ago. You sure it's a dragon? Oh, yes, sir, King Beowulf. He's been burning the counties all around us. Oh, that's too bad. Not many dragons left. Poor old dragon probably was hibernating up in the mountains. Somebody bothered him. Somebody stole some treasure. Boys, you all go around the counties and find out who's gotten rich all of a sudden. They said, yes, sir. Well, it wasn't long before all the neighbors started telling on their other neighbor and said, yeah, he got rich. He got a big house and big barns, and he's got all these horses now. And it wasn't long before the man with his slave was brought to Beowulf, and they told the story. And old Beowulf just shook his head. He said, that's pitiful. There aren't many dragons left. But I can't let this go. Once a dragon gets started like that, there's no stopping him. I've got to go kill that dragon. Well, all the warriors, including Beowulf's own kinsman, the last of their far-flung family, a young man named Wiglaf, tried to talk him out of it. He said, no, he'll be coming here next. Said, Wiglaf, you get together 12 of your finest young warriors, and we're going to go up into those mountains. We're going to kill us a dragon. And Wiglaf said, yes, uncle, whatever you say, sir. So Beowulf decided to go against this great monster, the greatest that he'd ever faced, a fire-breathing dragon. When they got up to the mountain, Beowulf found the flaw in the rock that the slave had told him about. And Beowulf called to the dragon, come on, old smoky guts! Where are you hiding? I'm Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow. I'm Beowulf who killed Grendel and Grendel's mother. I'm Beowulf who's going to kill you. And the dragon couldn't believe any little human was so foolish as to shout at it from inside his mountain. So out came the dragon before Beowulf even knew what was going on, and fire began to pour. Wiglaf looked around at the warriors, and they were gone. They were already headed down the mountain. They were so scared. Wiglaf said, we promised we'd help him when time came. It's time, let's go. But the warriors would not respond, so Wiglaf had to come up to his kinsman's side. Beowulf's helmet had already melted on his head, burning him badly. Beowulf was just hiding behind his shield while this napalm from this dragon was just pouring all over him, this liquid fire. You could see a chink in the belly of the dragon, a place where the scales were off. He said, look, uncle, look. Let's attack him there. Let's plunge our swords in there. And they ran forward, and they plunged their swords into the soft belly of the dragon. The dragon fell dead, but Wiglaf looked over, and he saw that Beowulf was too badly burned, and he knew his great kinsman was not going to survive. The warriors, meanwhile, had come back up the mountain when they heard all the quiet. Wiglaf berated them for leaving when they were needed the most. But they all surrounded Beowulf. And Beowulf said, boys, take me into the heart of the cave. I want to see the treasure that I sold my life for. And then he ordered that the treasure be taken out of the caves. He said, it does no good to bury treasure with people. He said, use this to help rebuild all the villages that had been burned by the dragon. And Wiglaf, you're the last of our far-flung family. I name you the heir to the throne. You are the next king. Boys, you are all witnesses to this. And they all swore they would support Wiglaf as the next king. When Beowulf died, they took his body back home. They burned it in a funeral pyre and took the ashes, put them by a beach. Wiglaf ordered white stones be heaped around the ashes, so much that it built up a mound, a little lighthouse, where they had torches. And Wiglaf said, the ships that pass by will see this mound and know that is Beowulf's mound, and they will all pay tribute as they pass by. Then he ordered his warriors to tell stories and sing songs of the great deeds of their hero Beowulf. And so that is the end of our oldest, longest story that we have in the English language. A story that starts out with a man who is primarily a Superman, a much larger-than-life figure, but one who ends up very, very human at the end, facing an end that nobody escapes. Wiglaf carried on Beowulf's memory and ruled well and wisely to the end of his days. The end.